Hello everyone, welcome to HIM216. This is a continuation of the lectures for Chapter 11 in your textbook. This is not a required lecture, but I am going over information that I think will be very helpful to you as you work through this chapter. I want you to turn to page 228 in your textbook, 228, 229. It's very important to understand the way that things are worded and phrased to help you determine what is a primary neoplasm, what is a secondary neoplasm, to learn to recognize what metastasis is. And so there are some terms here in your textbook that I just wanted to go over. And on the bottom of page 228, the first one I want us to look at is lung cancer with metastasis to the brain. In this example, the lung cancer is the primary site, and the metastasis to the brain is the secondary site. If I'm working in the neoplasm table, and I go to lung, I am going to choose the column for malignant primary. If I am working with brain, I am going to choose the column for malignant secondary, because this tells me that the lung cancer has moved into the brain. It has metastasized. If we look at this next example, it's worded a little differently. Lung cancer metastatic to the brain. It means the same thing. The lung cancer has metastasized to the brain. The next example, brain cancer metastatic from the lung. In looking at this, we know that the metastasis in the brain is from the lung. So again, we're working with lung as malignant primary and brain as malignant secondary. Look on page 229. The first example is non-small cell carcinoma of lung and brain. This is the same thing. This is primary lung and secondary brain. Non-small cell carcinoma is a type of cancer that originates in the lung, and it has metastasized to the brain. And then in the final example on 229, we have documentation of metastatic lung cancer. In this particular example, we know that the lung cancer is a primary site, but we don't necessarily know where it's gone. It doesn't tell us here where it has metastasized to. And so there is a specific code that we can assign in these particular instances. That code is C79.9. And in the neoplasm table, if we type in metastatic, you can see that there is not a code for malignant primary, but we find that code C79.9, and that is the code for a secondary malignant neoplasm of an unspecified site. Okay. I want you to look at the top of page 231. And in this example, we have metastatic islet cell carcinoma of the pancreas. And this is another example of when we know the primary site, which is the pancreas, but we don't have documentation of where this cancer has metastasized to, and so we're coding C79.9. And your book tells you, it says, in this preceding example, the carcinoma is documented as metastatic. And when a primary site has been determined, then a code must be identified a secondary site. And if no metastatic site is specified, then we assign the code from C79.9, which is, of course, unknown. Now, there may also be times that the primary site is not known, only the site that the cancer has metastasized to is documented. So in the index, if you type in unknown site or unspecified, if you type in unknown, and if I were you, I would make a note of this. If you put in unknown, you can see that malignant primary C80.1, and that's the code for cancer in OS, or anytime you have cancer documented, but you don't have a primary site identified. And then malignant secondary C79.9, and that's one of the codes that we have been looking at. Look at the third example, metastatic brain cancer. And in this example, they have sequenced C80.1. They have used C80.1, C79.31. Now, this is metastatic brain cancer. This means that the cancer has metastasized to the brain, and we're going to look at that information here in just a second. And in the neoplasm table, if we go to brain, we can see that the code for a malignant secondary neoplasm is C79.31. Now, I want to go back up on page 231. Basically, there are malignant neoplasms of sites that are exceptions to the normal rule about using the term metastatic. And in these situations, instead of coding to an unknown primary or to the morphology, these sites are always coded as secondary neoplasms. So these are sites that you probably want to put on a note card. So if you have documentation of bone cancer, you assume it's secondary unless they document that it's primary. Cancer of the brain, documented, it's coded as a malignant secondary. Diaphragm, heart, liver, lymph nodes, mediastinum, meninges, peritoneum, pleura, retroperitoneum, spinal cord, and any sites classified to C76. So what this means is if you had a diagnosis that a patient had brain cancer, you would be coding it as a malignant secondary, and then you can also apply the code for unknown primary. And we can see that category C76 is ill-defined sites, and as we scroll down through here, you can see these sites: head, neck, face, thorax, abdomen, pelvis, so on and so forth. So these are really ill-defined sites. I actually wouldn't expect you to be using these codes on an inpatient because I would think that the documentation would be very specific. If we look at this second example on 231, metastatic carcinoma of the breast. So we know that breast is malignant primary, and so we have the code, that code, C50.919. Metastatic tells us that it has moved, it has gone someplace else, but we don't know where it has gone, and so we assign the code of C79.9, because in the neoplasm, if we go to unknown, we know that it doesn't matter where it went, and we need to document that it has that metastasis. We're going to use that code, C79.9. When we look at the metastatic brain cancer, in that example, the brain is on the list of secondary neoplasms just above, and the morphology type is not stated. So therefore, we're going to use the code of C79.31 for this malignant secondary, and then we'll also use a code for the unknown primary, C80.1. So it's very important for you to be familiar with this list of sites that are typically considered to be malignant secondary, unless the documentation specifically tells you otherwise. Now, definitely, there are people that get osteosarcomas. They do get cancers of bones. There are patients that do get brain cancer. There are patients that do get cancer of the liver. And those will be documented as primary because typically they're secondary. So be very careful with that. In the next to the last example on the bottom of the page, renal cell carcinoma with metastasis to the adrenal glands. The renal cell carcinoma is the primary site, the malignant primary, and the adrenal glands is secondary because it says metastasis to the adrenal glands. In the last example on 231, metastatic bone cancer. The primary neoplasm is unknown. Bone is on that list up there. So if it says metastatic bone, we're not assuming it started in the bone and metastasized someplace we don't know. What we're saying is that we don't know where it came from, but it has metastasized to the bone. So the bone is going to be coded as a malignant secondary, and then the primary neoplasm will be unknown. It'll be the C80.1. And again, do not confuse malignant primary and malignant secondary with a principal and secondary diagnoses. You would not ever have a principal diagnosis code that came from this unknown either C81 or C79.9. Those would be secondary codes. The actual specified site, whether it's malignant primary or malignant secondary, is what would be documented. And it'd be coded. That's what you would be coding, is the specific site, not one of these unknown codes. Now, I would expect you to be reading this chapter very carefully, going back over these different areas, the guidelines, reviewing the terms so that you are familiar with the different types of neoplasms. And if you have any questions, be sure and get in touch with your instructor. But this is a complex chapter. It's a chapter that's coded from quite frequently because of the prevalence of cancer. So it is something that you need to look at carefully. And if you have any questions, don't hesitate to ask those. And that will conclude this lecture for Chapter 11. And other than the lecture that covers the homework assignment, this is the last lecture for this chapter.